My name's Andrew Katz. I'm a lawyer. I'm with a firm called Moorcrofts. I've been advising on free and open source software since the 90s. I have another hat, which is that I am the CEO of a company called ORCRO, which is a compliance company. And this company includes work around compliance in terms of open source licensing. Now, this talk is called Introducing OpenChain. One thing that's probably worthwhile emphasizing right from the outset is that OpenChain has nothing whatsoever to do with blockchain. Unfortunately, there is another project called OpenChain, which is to do with blockchain. This is nothing to do with it. So if you've got blockchain, you'll be very delighted to hear I'm not going to be talking about blockchain at all. And I'm not going to be talking about anything at all by the looks of things. This is a FINOS conference, so the focus is on financial services. So I just briefly want to talk about risk management in the finance sector. There are a lot of drivers towards compliance, as you know, finance sector, very heavily regulated. An example is MiFID II. So one of the obligations under the outsourcing section of MiFID II is to make sure that you avoid undue operational risk. So, how do you manage risk? Right, this is really going back to first principles. Well, there's three ways of dealing with that. Either you can pass that risk onto the outsourcing provider themselves through a contract, or you can pass the risk onto some sort of third party, like an insurance company, or ideally and most effectively, you can identify, minimize, and manage that risk. And that's really a process question. This is the most important of the risk management issues. So, if you're talking about risks that are inherent in software, what are the risks that we're talking about? Well, there's functionality. Software doesn't work properly. That's something that OpenChain is not particularly concerned about, so we'll skip over that one. We're concerned about security as well. That's something that's clearly of great importance. OpenChain is not particularly interested in security. What OpenChain is particularly focusing on is the question of licensing and IP risk. So if we just cover each one of those categories very briefly. So how do you deal with functionality risk? Well, you make sure that the software comes from a trusted source and you make sure that it goes through appropriate quality assurance. That's really all I'm going to say about that. With security, okay, trusted source quality assurance are also relevant. You may subject that software to things like pen testing and fuzzing, or the service that's provided by the outsourced service provider. The Linux Foundation has a core infrastructure initiative that's very much focused on this as well. Safe Code is another initiative that is intended to ensure that software components have minimal vulnerabilities. And then there's a number of tooling providers like Black Duck and Flexera, for example, that provide commercial solutions as far as security is concerned. OpenChain is not particularly concerned with those. What we're mainly concerned about is licensing and IP. And to make sure that the components that you're using are correctly licensed, then first of all, trusted source is obviously important. You need to look at the license compatibility, so make sure that the licenses that you're using the various components under don't cause a licensing problem when you combine them, and I'll explain this in a little more depth later. And there's various sorts of tooling that can try to automate this process. Black Duck and Flexera, on the flip side, also do that sort of thing. FOSS-ID is another one. And then on the open source side of things, there are tools like Quartermaster that also can provide solutions. So what happens if everything goes horribly wrong from a legal licensing perspective? Well, it's possible that you may end up with a claim against you which results in payment of some sort of damages, but potentially most damaging is the possibility that there is an injunction that prevents you from using that software which is maybe business critical to you. Or it may be that you're using an outsourced service provider, then the provision ceases. Okay, let's try that again. Right, copyright. Okay, so it may be because of some contractual obligation that you have with your outsourced service provider. If there is some sort of issue as far as intellectual property is concerned, they cease that provision. But let's step back a little bit and look at the context of modern software development. It's all about assembling components. So I'm stealing an idea from some Linux Foundation slides here, just to give you an idea of how this works. So basically the way that modern software development works is you choose a framework, then you write some custom code on top of that framework, and then to provide particular specific functionality, you use a bunch of open source libraries. And in a typical project, it's not unusual to find that the amount of open source used is in the region of 90%. The custom code is around 10%. That's not unusual. So an awful lot of the code that is being used is open source. And there are many different sources of that open source code. SourceForge, GitHub, Maven Central Repository being three examples. So now we talk about the legal bit. The little asterisk there means that I'm oversimplifying. So I haven't got time to explain in detail, but let's make the assumption that every component of software that you use is subject to copyright. You're only able to use those components if each one of them is correctly licensed. So every component has to be properly licensed. So what happens if the components are not correctly licensed? Okay, well, here's an example. Is anyone familiar with the Linksys WRT54G? So here we go, it's a picture of this beautiful beast. It's a classic router that was introduced in, I think, 2004, something like that. Long story short is that it had some Linux-based firmware on it. The Free Software Foundation decided that there was a potential infringement claim, so they started proceedings against Cisco, which owned Linksys at the time. Anyway, they ultimately reached a settlement, and which meant that not only was the firmware of this router made available, it also became an absolute bestseller on the basis that it was one of the few routers available at the time that was very easy to put an alternative firmware in. So the projects like OpenWRT, which now provides firmware for just about any router you can lay your hands on. But in the outset, it was based, because of the WRT, it was based on this specific router. And I had a look on the line yesterday. There's a version of this, the WRT50GL, which was introduced in about, I think, 2005 specifically as a Linux-based router. It's still available. So it's a piece of technology that you can still buy. They're still making it. Apparently, it still makes millions of dollars a year for Linksys. Even though it's about sort of 40, 50 quid, you can spend significantly less and actually get a much more highly functioned router. So, what are the scenarios that are relevant when you need to do an analysis? Okay, you need to know what code you've got and what the licensing situation is if somebody comes at you with an infringement claim. There may be a case that somebody wants to have a look at your code base because there's some sort of corporate due diligence going on. So potentially there could be an IPO or some sort of funding or an acquisition. Sometimes I've helped clients to have a look at their software compliance because of customer due diligence. And this is something that will typically happen in a highly regulated business like the finance sector. So something like MiFID may be driving the customers of an outsourced service provider to say to that outsourced service provider, you are a critical part of our business infrastructure. What are you doing to make sure that you are compliant with all of your licensing so that we can minimize the risk that there's a potential problem of the service suddenly being unavailable because of some sort of infringement problem. And the concerns that organizations may have is that because of the inadvertent inclusion of some part of their code, the whole of their code base, may be inadvertently open sourced, or even that they may be forced to release their entire code base, including the secret source, because it contains some code like GPL that may require them to do so. Asterisk there, query whether that's possible or not, but this is a fear that people have. So how do you demonstrate as an organization that has a code base that you're compliant with all of the licenses? Well, what you need to do is to analyze the code and analyze the licenses. And it tends to be a truism that anyone that has ever been involved in a due diligence process is that really it's not so much about the information, it's not so much about the information that you receive back as part of that process, but it's about the process itself. So when I've been involved in due diligence processes, I feel a lot more comfortable going into an organization that can present me with a set of information that is well organized, that's obviously been reached by a sensible process, than if I go into an organization where everything's a complete mess, even if when you go to the underlying information, it is actually all there. So this means a sensible, well-run organization will have some sort of open source compliance program. What does this look like? Well, first of all, you need to verify that the company is compliant with the licenses. And then you need to make sure that there are good practices and procedures in place to ensure that that compliance is maintained. So typically, the sort of things that you would expect to see in a well-run organization are, first of all, an open source policy itself. You need to make sure that the staff are appropriately trained. They know about the policy. They know what the use cases are when it kicks in. Some sort of policy for reviewing the licenses for inbound code to make sure that they fit in with the uses of the software and what the outbound licenses are going to be. That the responsibilities of the individuals who are tasked with dealing with these particular issues are identified, that their roles are empowered, and that they're properly funded, they have the resources enabled to enable them to do their job. You need to ensure that a bill of materials for the products is generated. So, in other words, for each product, you know exactly the software components that have gone into that product, and you know the licenses are attached to them. And you need to have some sort of program for dealing with common issues that may arise, common queries that you may get from your developer base or externally. Then you need to make sure that you have appropriate compliance materials that are provided with the software. So there's Apache components in there, for example. They have the appropriate notice.txt files. For other licenses, they have the license text or the disclaimers or whatever the license demands that you need to supply alongside the license to make sure that it complies. And then you'll typically also have a contribution policy for external projects. And this is what I've been doing for years. When clients come to me and say we need to put in place an open source compliance policy, these are the steps that I've put in place. Which is why I was very interested a couple of years ago to come across OpenChain, which is a product of the Linux Foundation. It's very well backed. These are a few of the members. There are many more now, and I'm told there are a couple of very exciting announcements about to be made in the next few weeks with some other big names that are joining the list. So OpenChain essentially formalizes those characteristics that I was talking about earlier. It addresses the question, how do I trust free and open source software that's in my supply chain? What it is, well, it's a standard to describe what organizations could and should do to address FOSS compliance efficiently. And it identifies key recommended processes and record keeping requirements for effective FOSS management. And it builds trust and increases efficiency by having FOSS processes and record keeping consistent across the supply chain. So that means that organizations that are interacting with each other, they're supplying, one of them is supplying FOSS and the other organization is consuming FOSS, it reduces the friction between those organizations. So how does it do that? Well, it consists of three components. First of all, there's a specification, then there's a curriculum, and then there's the requirement for conformance. So let me explain those in turn. The specification defines a core set of requirements that every compliance program must satisfy. And the idea is that, I'll go into a little more detail about what these requirements are, but they're structured in such a way that organizations of all sizes should be able to to be able to implement the specification. The curriculum provides the educational basis, the materials that you need in order for people at different levels within the organisation to be able to educate themselves as to both what FOSS compliance is, but also specifically what the OpenChain project and compliance process is all about. And then conformance is the way that an organisation can demonstrate that it is conforming with the OpenChain specification. So for more details of the links there, I won't go into them at the moment, but the slides will be available later. So we're trying to build trust by creating a web of organisations which are consumers and suppliers of free and open source software, and so that we can ensure that they're all conformant with the OpenChain specification. It's all about reducing that friction of transferring software from one organisation to another. And there's nothing in the OpenChain specification that isn't something which well-run FOSS developing companies shouldn't be doing already. It just puts a little bit of structure around what people tend to be doing or should be doing on an ad hoc basis. So what does conformance actually require? Well, the first thing is that you need to have a formal FOSS policy, and you need to make sure that all of the relevant staff within your organisation know about it and they know how to access it. The relevant staff need to have training, so they need to know about the FOSS policy, they need to know about basic licensing law, they need to know about concepts and principles involved in open source licensing, and then you need to identify what the internal roles and responsibilities are of individuals who are at in different parts of your organisation who are dealing with the development, deployment, and other aspects of free and open source software. You need to have a process in place to establish the appropriate license for each of the components that you're using in a particular project, and then you need to have a mechanism for determining what the restrictions and obligations are applicable to those licenses. So that basically means you need to know if you're going to comply with GPL, what you have to do that. If you're going to comply with Apache, what you need to do in order to maintain compliance, and so on. And you've got to have an appointed individual who has responsibility for both external and internal FOSS liaison compliance. They can be the same person. So FOSS liaison really has two particular aspects of it. First of all, it's for when somebody within the organisation wants to get involved in a particular project, and they may want to contribute to a project, and then there needs to be a process for dealing with that. It also may be the case that various queries come from outside the organisation about that organisation's open source compliance, and the FOSS liaison person can assist with that process as well. And then you need to have an internal compliance function, and that person is responsible for making sure that all of the internal licensing is correctly followed, the internal processes are followed, and reviews the internal policies to make sure they work properly. So anyone that's ever had any involvement in any other sort of formal like quality assurance program, for example, none of this will look unusual at all. You know, the whole idea of this program is that it's something that is highly compatible with the other sort of practices and procedures that organizations have in terms of supply chain management. So you've got to have a process to establish the bill of materials, so to make sure that you know what all of the inbound components are in any particular piece of software that you are producing, and that the licenses are correctly assigned to each of the components that are contained in the bill of materials. And you need to make sure your license management process is able to deal with the common use cases that you would have with the various different types of open source license. And it's entirely legitimate for that process to be, for that policy to be very straightforward. I mean, some organizations have decided for good or bad reasons, for example, that they're not going to incorporate any GPL code into their code base at all. You know, we can argue till cows come home whether that's a good idea or not. But certainly, you know, I've worked with organizations where they say that to begin with, that would be a legitimate policy under the OpenChain specification. But then actually what happens is over time they tend to realise, their developers say, we need to use this GPL code, we're using it internally, I don't see what the problem is, or we want to engage with this particular community and we want to feed everything we're going to be doing on this project, we want to feed back again. So there tends to be sort of internal pressures from developers to come up with a more realistic policy. But these are all things that can be dealt with within the framework that OpenChain provides. You must also demonstrate that you prepared all of the appropriate materials that you need to be able to provide with the software release. So you'll be familiar with the fact that licenses frequently require that certain materials are provided alongside the code that you're providing. That can be the source code in certain cases. It can be an offer to make the source code available. More typically, it's a copy of the license itself or a copy of disclaimers contained within the license, or a notice file, for example, for Apache and some other licenses as well. So you need to make sure that to maintain compliance, all those materials are also made available. And so this is the one piece of social engineering that is contained within OpenChain. You must have a policy which covers contributions by the organisation to FOSS projects. Now that policy may, I would argue unwisely, say we do not contribute to FOSS projects. But the idea is that it's intended to make organisations sit and think about whether that's a good idea. It addresses their mind to the fact that they really should have some sort of policy, and being forced to put in black and white we don't contribute to external projects means that can start a dialogue with the developers, and the developers can be saying, hey guys, this really isn't such a great idea. There are plenty of good reasons why we do need to get involved in external projects. So there's a tiny little bit of social engineering in there. But the intention really is to try to get organisations to think about the ecosystem and how the ecosystem is better for everyone, the more people that contribute to it and get involved in it. And then finally, you've got to certify that you comply with the specifications requirement. And there's an online tool to enable people to do that. So at the moment, people are perfectly capable of self-certifying. They can go online, they can follow through the tool, and if you can tick all the boxes, then it will say, congratulations, you have now self-certified yourself as being OpenChain compliant. It is likely that on the roadmap of development, the next thing that happens is there are external organisations that will come in and formally validate that compliance. Our role as both Moorcrofts and ORCRO has been to help a number of organisations to get to the stage where they can self-certify, and they've been comfortable to do that. But I think in common with other certification regimes in other areas, it's likely that the next stage is going to be that other organisations, specific certification organisations, will be authorised to grant OpenChain certification to organisations. So what's the roadmap? Well, initially the idea is that members of the OpenChain project, first of all, they will encourage their suppliers to become OpenChain compliant. And then the stage may be reached that they will start to prefer their suppliers to be compliant, and they will prefer those suppliers who are compliant. And then the next stage is that it may be part of their supplier filtering system that they will only purchase from those suppliers who can demonstrate that they are compliant. So why is this a good thing? Well, it eases supplier due diligence. If you're looking at a number of competing suppliers, and if you know that they're OpenChain compliant, then it means that you know that they will have a set amount of information available to be able to demonstrate that they have fulfilled all of those good characteristics. They can demonstrate that people have been trained, they can demonstrate that they have all the materials that are necessary to go with the piece of software that you're purchasing from them. You know that they have processes in place that mean that the licenses that are attached to the various components in what you're purchasing have been properly verified, and so on. So basically, one very simple way of looking at it is that it provides a very simplified set of due diligence materials to enable somebody who is selecting a supplier to be able to say, right, can you give me all of your the materials that go alongside this particular software release? So we find it a lot easier then to determine that you're compliant with all these different aspects of OpenChain. So it standardizes the availability of those documents. And then from a legal perspective, it makes it a lot easier when you're drafting a contract with a supplier, because then a lot of the heavy lifting is done if you can simply incorporate a warranty into the agreement that says that the supplier warrants that they're OpenChain compliant, and that automatically means that they will be able to provide you with all of that additional material. So the idea is that this really generates a virtuous circle. That the more people that use OpenChain, it standardizes within different organizations the way that they handle open source compliance. It means that any two organizations who happen to be OpenChain compliant, who are dealing with each other, know what they are supposed to expect in terms of the due diligence materials they're receiving. They have some indication of how that other organization is undertaking its development processes to make sure that they're compliant. Ultimately, the intention is that the OpenChain project will be submitted to some form of formal standardization process, so it can stand alongside things like ISO 27001 as just one of the standards that a well-run organization will consider adhering to as part of their normal supply chain management process. So just thought it might be useful just to have a look at a few quick case studies. So one of the important characteristics of OpenChain is it's very carefully designed so that it's equally applicable to large organizations as to small organizations. I mean, clearly for a smaller organization, there's less to be done, but it is designed to be very, very scalable. So the organizations that I showed you in the earlier slide, they're all pretty large organizations. But I've worked with clients of all sizes, from very small companies to much larger companies. So to give you just a sort of flavour of the sort of work that I've been doing here, this is one specifically from the finance sector. So this is a software company that sells cloud services to pension providers. And this is the one where their regulated clients require that their customers undertake due diligence on them, so that their customers are comfortable that their system is not going to be turned off, basically, because of some sort of compliance issue. So we're now able to provide, as part of the due diligence process, those end customers with the materials required by OpenChain certification, and that means that they can tick, those customers can tick the box in terms of their own compliance. They can say, have we looked at the risk of what happens if our outsourced service provider suddenly ceases to function because of some sort of IP infringement issue? Yes, we have, and we're comfortable that they themselves are taking sensible steps to manage the risk, so we can rely on their risk management processes. And this is a sort of relatively small piece of software. There's about 20 developers working on it. There's like 100 different packages. So this is something where we've been able to do the compliance process manually. We've looked at all the different components manually, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that as the size of code bases dramatically increases. So this is another example. Much larger organization. They provide a sector-specific SaaS provision to a particular vertical market. They've got well over 2,000 components in their code. They've got about 200 developers. They are taking the commercial route to handle compliance. They're using Black Duck both to do an initial code scan to see what they've got, and also to fit into their development processes as well. And so why did they come to me, to us, and to help with this? Well, they realized that they had an internally generated need. There's something that they really needed to get a handle on what their compliance was. So they asked me to help them with that. But it's also because they are operating in a highly regulated sector, they know that they're going to be receiving questions both during the sales process and during their ongoing relationship with their customers along the lines of, what happens if our software suddenly ceases to work because of some sort of infringement issue? What steps are you taking to avoid that? It's not particularly mission critical. It's important, but it's not particularly mission critical, which is why this isn't something that has, there's been a sort of flurry of questions from clients so far, but they're moving into areas that are more mission critical, so they really want to anticipate the questions that their customers are going to be asking them, so they can say, yes, we're very confident that we've gone through this whole compliance process properly. And then this is one that I'm able to name. So this company called B2M Solutions, they provide some software. They have two different products. One's on-premise, one's in the cloud, but they basically do the same job, which is that they work with large organizations that have a big estate of mobile devices. So it may be mobile phones, or it may be organizations that, for example, have those little scanners that delivery people have to monitor when a parcel has arrived. And so this is software that interacts with them, and they can provide details of how many machines there are out in the field, and what their battery state is, and how reliable they are, and all this sort of good stuff. They use an awful lot of open source software. Interestingly enough, one of their biggest resellers, big Japanese organization, is itself OpenChain compliant. So they were quite familiar with the idea of OpenChain, and they were very supportive of this organization achieving OpenChain compliance. We did a manual compliance job on this one because there's also a relatively small number of components, so there's fewer than 100 components in their code base. And they have around 15 developers. But we'd already done about 90% of the work as part of the previous compliance exercise. And it was really when I introduced OpenChain, I said, well, why don't you become OpenChain compliant? It only takes an extra 10%, which was basically the two areas that we hadn't covered already, were appointing a liaison officer to deal with external liaison, putting in a policy for dealing with external projects, and also a little bit of training as well. That's the other thing that we did. But that was really a day's work. We put those additional bits in, and then we were able to get them to a stage where they were comfortable to self-certify as OpenChain compliant. So, in summary, open source is all over the place, you know that. Infringement risk is an important consideration, not only in terms of regulatory compliance, but also in terms of procurement and M&A activities. The risk can be assessed by analysing the code and licensing, and it can be managed by implementing a sensible inclusion and use policy, which is basically what OpenChain is. Adopting OpenChain is intended to increase efficiency in the supply chain. So it provides a framework for compliance. There are other projects which you'll be hearing about today, some of which you may have heard about already, that are very closely interrelated with this. So there's SPDX, which provides a license taxonomy. It's intended to ensure that each open source software license has a specific tag attached to it, so it makes it a lot easier when producing bills and materials to be able to very specifically identify the license that is attached to a particular component. SW360, which Michael spoke about earlier on. That also assists with license compliance catalogue management. Fossology is another open source tool which assists with license scanning and enables you to look at a code base and identify from that code base what the licenses are by scanning the license text and looking at other useful attributes like copyright notices and so on. So really to populate the database of everything that goes with the bill of materials. Quartermaster is another project that's fairly early stages, but that's basically a graph database that will look at a project, including all of its dependencies, go right down the tree to all the dependencies, create a graph database, and the intention of that is that once you have a full picture of all of the components that a project contains and what the licenses are, then you'll be able to apply policies to each of the relationships and the dependencies to determine whether, within a particular company's rules, that particular license relationship is acceptable. Ultimately, the idea is that that will fit within part of the tool chain. So when you compile the project, as well as doing all of the sort of technical bits on the compiling, the linking, and grabbing all the dependencies from external resource repositories, etc., it will also go through a license compliance process, and ultimately you want to get to a position where it just says, yeah, that was fine, based on the specific policies that you've put into it. Right, okay, so I have gone through that extremely rapidly, so that's okay. So I think we've probably got time for maybe one or two questions. So, yes, one over here.
Can you give us a sense for how many companies have gone through the OpenChain certification process?
I don't know, actually. Dave, have you got a sort of a feel for that?
A couple dozen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's pretty early stages at the moment. I mean I've personally I've got 5 compliance projects going on at the moment. Only one of which has sort of made it to final completion. The rest are all in course. I mean that sort of gives you an idea. But you know, we're talking to some very large organisations who really want to sort of roll that out across all of their companies.
And do those organisations in a specific sector, are you finding that there's adoption in one sector more than any other?
I mean, geographically, there's a lot of activity in the Far East because Shane Coughlin, who's the program manager for OpenChain, is very active. He lives in Japan, so he's very active over there. So that's why there's sort of companies like sort of Hitachi, Toyota, Panasonic. But it's probably not true to say there's any. It is sector specific. There's a fair amount of automotive. I mean, Toyota's been mentioned in there, but I'm talking to a lot of other large automotive companies who are sort of equally interested as well. So there's certainly a lot of interest in automotive. Yeah.
What sort of level of protection, if any, does being part of this give? Obviously, banks are pretty large targets, particularly from, say, patent trolls as an example, with an IP troll after some piece of the Apple SDK a few years ago. Apple had a license. They said that none of the developers did and went after them. What sort of level of protection was this?
In terms of actual protection, I mean, none at all. It's really intended to be a means of knowing what your code base is, and also being able to look at what other organisations have done, so that you can simplify the due diligence process. But you can work along other organisations like Open Invention Network and LotNet, which can sort of help with some of the patent issues as well. Yes, sorry.
So a couple of things. But, you haven't mentioned transfer pricing and that as an issue, which is surprising me a little bit. That's a big issue in Europe right now. These folks aren't even thinking about it yet. And the other one was, as this was billed as a thing about patents, you haven't really offered much about the sort of patent situation and companies that screwed up with that in their attempts to get open source out the door. So comments on both of those things.
Right, just on to the transfer pricing issue. Sorry, can you sort of explain a little more?
There are various attempts going on right now in Europe to try to derive a little revenue from what they perceive as global multinationals.
Yes.
Various ideas, most of which are ill-advised, like building tax. But the deal with transfer pricing is in a global multinational that has operations in various countries. Now has to assess value at the point that they transfer software, even internal software, across a company boundary into another subsidiary.
Right.
It's not even clear how this is going to be possible because we're not valuing software like that.
No, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think in a way that sort of has. It may have the effect of negating some of the benefits of open source software in the first place. I mean, one of the benefits that I see in open source software is the ability for organisations to come together and collaborate between themselves in a way that is not subject in the same way to sort of antitrust competition law scrutiny. I guess a similar concern as far as transfer pricing is concerned. And if you can apply the similar sort of arguments to say, well, hang on, anyone can get involved in this particular organisation, like the Geneva project, for example, which involves large automotive manufacturers, but all the way down to individuals. So if anyone can get involved in it, and if really the only way that this project is being centrally managed is through its license agreement, then that negates the antitrust issues. Then I guess you could try to apply the same argument as far as open source and transfer pricing is concerned, and say, well, fundamentally, if we're producing open source software, this software is available not only to ourselves internally, but to anyone else, essentially at zero cost. Whether that's an argument that'll run or not. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting and sort of scary issue. And it's not specifically something that's addressed by OpenChain, but it is an interesting and scary issue. And sorry, what was the second?
The other one was patents and people trying to muck with licensing to make the patent issue go away.
Yeah, and again, I think this is something that OpenChain is really agnostic to that. All it's doing is making it easier for people to get the information they need about components and licensing, and then they can make their own determination as to whether any patent issues available that they need to look at.
I'm curious to know what patent issue you're talking about.
Well, look at Facebook trying to call the act open source, but adding a draconian patent license, which they claimed was anti-piracy, but was actually just making it impossible to use their software. So,
well, but I think, yeah, okay. So, I mean, in that sense, OpenChain's about processes around open source, right? So, if you have processes that suit to,
so OpenChain would accurately report that it was an MIT licensed piece of software and not catch that there was a separate agreement on top of it about patents that basically negated its openness, right? So.
No, I mean, I think.
Is there anything that actually does? I'm not
Yeah.
aware of anything that does that. I don't
No.
know if it does. And on Facebook, they've opted back into IM with.
Yeah, because we forced them to.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but that happens. So that means less of a concern. Is there anything else specific on that?
Well, there's tons of companies that are going to try this, right? We're in a new era of wiggling around the open source licensing to try to create effects, which is always dangerous. Right? So I don't think that OpenChain is effectively yet dealing with the issue that, has this license been modified in any way that we need to know?
No.
Well,
I mean,
wait, let me finish.
yeah.
And then we need to wrap up this thing. Sorry.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
I see what you're saying, and I think, definitely concerned. I totally agree with that. But I think the point of OpenChain was to create trust in the supply chain by knowing that your supplier has a process, because there was no transparency around that previously, and so then you get companies asking for info and then getting info, and then again going, oh, how do I trust that, whatever. So I think the indirect answer is that by having a standard that talks about what good processes look like, you just sort of, open that up to some companies were in the dark about that, which are very many. And then if you have a process, you're more likely to find those things. If you don't have a process, I think exactly what you said would happen, or sort of misidentification is far more likely. But if you're aware and educated on the issues and that you need education in your company and that you need to have these processes, then those processes should be catching those kind of nefarious
I think
things.
it's a good point there that maybe OpenChain should actually look at whether or not you have something in your recommendations, whether it's curriculum specification that hooks the patent defences. I know Jamie's speaking about that at the end of the day today.
Yeah.
But
There is. I can talk to you about that separately. I mean, when I'm dealing with clients, I've sort of gone one step beyond OpenChain. I've got a little section that talks about patents separately, but it's not, but it's not currently part of the OpenChain specification. So there's scope to have a look at that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody.